Good afternoon, everyone. It's Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we have another of our virtual event series here. And today we have two terrific journalists, both of whom have new books out. Nicholas Griffin is a journalist and author of 4 novels and 3 works of nonfiction. His writing has appeared in The Times, London, Financial Times, and Foreign Policy,
Hey, Joanna.
and other publications. His book, Ping Pong Diplomacy, was shortlisted for the PEN ESPN Award for literary sports writing. He lives in Miami with his wife and 2 children. And Griffin's latest book is The Year of Dangerous Days, Riots, Refugees, and Cocaine in Miami, 1980. And if you didn't see it, just a couple of weeks ago, we did a really terrific program with Nick talking all about the book, also with John Sanford, who was a former award-winning reporter for the Miami Herald during the period that Nick's writing about. So it's a neat program, and you can catch it on our Facebook page or on YouTube. But today we have Alan Feuer, who covers courts and criminal justice for the Metro desk of the New York Times. He's written about mobsters, jails, police misconduct, wrongful convictions, and government corruption. Lot to write about these days, eh, Alan?
I'm busy.
His work has also appeared in Rolling Stone, Harper's Magazine, and Men's Journal. He's also written the book Over There about his time spent covering the war in Iraq. Feuer's new book is El Jefe, the stalking of Chapo Guzman. So gentlemen, welcome. It's a real treat to have you both.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Nick has kindly agreed to come in as an assist, and I'm largely going to be, you'll all be relieved, in the background, but I may pop up for a couple of questions. But I'm fascinated to hear 2 reporters talking to each other. And so Nick has agreed to conduct most of this interview. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nick. But before I do that, point of order. Those of you watching this on Facebook, which is all of you, if you have questions you want to submit, go ahead and send them in, and I'll be monitoring this during the program, and I'll be asking questions kind of towards the end. So over to you, Nick.
Okay, great. Well, I'm very, very pleased to be here with Alan. I have just finished this a couple of days ago. It's a fantastic read. It's super fast. It's not an uncomplicated book, and yet it reads as if it is an easy book, but it's not, which is an achievement in itself. So thank you, Alan, for that. But I think maybe the place to start is, we all know the name El Chapo, but I think we probably need a sort of reminder of who the man was and how he built this sort of extraordinary empire that then several governments tried to dismantle. But if you could give us sort of an overview to kick off.
Sure. So I guess the way I would describe Chapo Guzman is he is a kind of 3rd generation narco trafficker, and arguably the most famous, to date. He kind of enters the world of narco trafficking in the mid to late 1980s, coincidental with the real boom in the cocaine trade in the United States, and not coincidentally, shortly before the NAFTA treaty is signed, deregulating the American border with Mexico, which obviously permits lots and lots and lots of truck traffic across the border. He is probably best known as a smuggling innovator. His main innovation was the cross-border tunnel. He was the guy who kind of came up with that idea and put it into operation. And his other calling card was, of course, that he was a master of evasion and escape. For decades, as his business increased, his profile mounted, and the appetite of both American and Mexican law enforcement officials to capture him got bigger. He was able to escape capture, and once he was captured, escaped from prison twice, which is a kind of remarkable feat. He, in some sense, at the end of his career, was a top 10 criminal of all time. I mean, in terms of his kind of anti-hero personality and profile, I would say he ranks up there with Al Capone, John Gotti, Jesse James, in terms of his kind of notoriety and fame, and was just a master of criminal logistics. You know, the guy ran a drug empire that equaled what FedEx and Amazon do on a daily basis, but did it all on the wrong side of the law. I was just talking to someone, the old story about how, Fred Astaire was a great dancer, but Ginger Rogers had to do what Fred Astaire did backwards and in high heels. So Chapo Guzman did what FedEx and Amazon do every day, but backwards and in high heels.
Now, of course, in the 80s, there was that sort of weird moment when sort of the illegal almost is viewed through a legal frame, when Forbes starts putting sort of the world's greatest narco traffickers on its rich list to see where they would compute. Where would El Chapo have ended up there? What when it comes to numbers, what was he really? What was he making?
So Forbes put him on the list. He came in at 701 on the Forbes billionaire list, and I want to say 2008 or 9. And today you can go on to eBay and buy a baseball cap that says 701, and that just is a reference to Chapo Guzman. But for example, when the United States government won a conviction against Chapo Guzman last year, and was seeking to obtain a forfeiture from him, right? So the government now gets to seize his money. They put his earnings at north of $12 billion. And that is a conservative estimate of the minute fraction that the US government was able to prove that he actually trafficked. So for every kilo of cocaine, by his own estimation, that was seized, 100 more made it across the border unseized. So you could conceivably add, like 2 zeros to that $12 billion figure, which is it's astonishing. He was in the same kind of forfeiture documents. He was the official tally of the United States government when they added up cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamines. It was about 1.3 million kilos over the course of his career. And again, that's the fraction that they actually got, that they could physically prove he smuggled. It's just it's mind-boggling numbers.
Yeah, no, it is. So when you're dealing with these sort of numbers and sort of a man who's already become a myth while he's still, hard at work on the wrong side of legality, how did you begin to sort of deconstruct that myth? And was there a moment in your research, or perhaps when you were, attending the trial, where he begins to sort of come across in 3 dimensions?
That's a great question. So I got to sit in the same room with Chapo Guzman for 3.5 months during the trial. And, in terms of bringing him into 3 dimensions, that was the kind of dispositive period, right? And he was in the pre-trial phase. So he was extradited to the United States kind of remarkably. He showed up for the very first time in a United States District Court on on the day at almost at exactly the same hour that Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. And there was almost a good 2-year period of pretrial hearings where he showed up, and they were arguing over motions and how the trial was going to be conducted. During those 2 years, I attended each one of those hearings. He was a cipher. He was a blank. He was a nothing. He betrayed no emotion, no humanity, zero. And it was only once the trial began that he kind of came to life. He began kind of scribbling in a notepad, and you could see him taking active engagement in his trial. And as we were just discussing before this all began, there was a day when actor who plays Chapo Guzman on the Netflix Narcos Mexico series came to the courtroom to do some kind of reconnaissance research on him, and word quickly made its way from the door of the courtroom, through the room to Chapo at the defense table. And when his lawyer told him that the actor who plays him on television was in the room, he lit up like an incandescent bulb and looked around the room and found the actor and waved hello to him, which was just, it's an incredibly telling moment that's what this guy cared. His life's on the line. He's about to go away to prison for the rest of his days, but he was obsessed and thrilled to see the actor who played him on TV there in the room.
And of course, that's a sort of recurring theme for him over the last sort of decade of how he may or may not be represented in film. Could you break that down a little bit, because there have been some very strange episodes? It's
crazy. It's insane. So Chapo Guzman is running arguably the world's largest and most sophisticated drug empire. Hundreds, if not thousands, of employees on 5 continents. As I said, billions of dollars in inventory, trucks, planes, buses, trains, cars, you name it. At the same time, the United States government and the Mexican government are after him with untold amounts of resources. The FBI, the CIA, the DEA, Homeland Security. During all of this, he nonetheless finds the mental bandwidth and the energy to be obsessed with making a movie about his own life. And he not only hires a Colombian writer, film producer to write a biography about him, interviews his ex-wife, children, mentor, and is putting together this manuscript that they want to flip into a screenplay. He's reaching out to Hollywood people all the time. Most notably, the Mexican soap opera star Kate Del Castillo, amongst others. And he becomes obsessed with telling his own story on the big screen. And it's a testament to his ego, his arrogance. He wanted, against the laws of criminality, to be seen. Most mafia bosses want to live in the shadows. Chapo Guzman wanted to be out there and have his story told, which is just kind of crazy.
Was there ever a moment where it actually looked like it might happen?
Well, there was a couple moments where it looked like it might happen. The most famous moment is he reaches out, he gets Kate Del Castillo to buy the rights to his life story. This happens while he is imprisoned, and despite the fact that he has already tried to assassinate the Colombian biographer that he hired to do the book/screenplay, and the personal assistant whom he has placed in charge of the movie project itself. Whether Kate Del Castillo knew about this or not, who knows? Kate Del Castillo then decides that she wants to bring on an American movie star to sort of make the project more viable, who does she choose? Famously, she chooses Sean Penn. Sean Penn, it remains unclear how committed he actually was to the idea of making a Chapo Guzman biopic. Nonetheless, he has already had his own arrangements with Rolling Stone magazine to interview Chapo Guzman. And this whole crazy entourage, including 2 Argentinian film producers, decided to get on a plane and fly to Mexico to meet Chapo Guzman to talk about the movie project at the exact same moment that American law enforcement and the Mexican military have decided that they have found Chapo Guzman and they're going to raid him at his mountain hideaway. So that what struck me over and over again about this story is the intersection of the kind of most serious and sober themes you can imagine, drug trafficking, murder, government corruption, and the most absurd things you can imagine, a la the story I just told you. And there's no, and when it comes to Chapo Guzman, there's no separating those 2 things. They are the poles of his personality, and it's just nuts.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible scene in the book, and one we couldn't resist. Hopefully we haven't, a spoiler alert, but I don't think we really spoiled that one. But I mean, when you think about El Chapo, I think one thing people fail to realize is just how long he spent in the game, and he's not even the longest, because his sort of semi-partner. Could you just go into a bit of the longevity and I don't know what the average length of a high-ranking drug dealer is, but right. I wouldn't think it would be particularly long.
Right. So Chapo Guzman kind of enters the drug trade. I mean, he really enters it in, let's see, the kind of late 60s, early 70s as a gopher, and his first drug deal. So I got to, as part of my research, I got to see a copy of this biography that I was describing to you that he hired this Colombian author to write. And that's actually, it's never really been published. It's just out there. And this guy describes, after interviewing Chapo Guzman, that Chapo's first drug deal was driving a Ford pickup full of Mexican marijuana across the United States border when Chapo was 16 years old. But he really comes up in the early 80s and is still kind of working at the height of his powers in 2016, which is his final, when he's finally done. So you're really talking here about, like 30 to 40 years. And it's astonishing length of time. And that is partly due to his wiliness, his kind of inherent paranoia, which was both a detriment to his safety, ironically enough, but obviously kept him safe over the years because he was so paranoid about everyone. And it's also a testament to the vast amounts of money that he spent bribing the Mexican government, which was the true source of his shelter and protection. And as you mentioned, he's not even the longest lived. His kind of primary partner and ally, a guy named Mayo Zambada, is still at large in Mexico, kind of carrying on with the business that he and Chapo Guzman, kind of formally created in the early 2000s. So.
And he's been at it for even longer than El Chapo, right?
I mean, yeah, he's older, he's wiser, he's quieter, and he's arguably more brutal. And Mayo is over 70 years old. I mean, actually, not. He's nearing 70 years old, and is just kind of in terms of personality, is kind of the opposite of Chapo Guzman. If Chapo Guzman was always interested in self-promotion and in in basking in the public spotlight. Mayo is very old school. He's said to really not go out much. He's said to favor his wife's home cooking. But during the chase for Chapo Guzman that I describe in the book, there is a moment when the United States government, having penetrated the communications network of the cartel so profoundly, realized that they could simultaneously go after Chapo Guzman and Mayo Zambada at the same time. And there was an attempt to capture Mayo shortly before there was an attempt to capture Guzman in 2014. And ironically enough, the trigger that set the US government off to know that they could get Mayo was he had moved from his stronghold ranch in outside of the main city in Sinaloa state in Mexico to a kind of remote country estate, right? But the maids and cooks at his kitchen in the main estate were sending like vast amounts of food to this kind of remote country ranch where Mayo was living, and the American government had essentially wiretapped the cooks and maids, and so they were aware that the kitchens of Mayo's main estate was sending food to the kind of remote place, and they realized that, oh, that must mean that Mayo and his security entourage had taken up residence at, like Ranch B, and that's what, triggered the attempt to grab him there, which ultimately failed.
So in all these, this sort of dance that goes on between sort of the legal and the illegal institutions in US and Mexico over the years, who's the toughest opposition for El Chapo? Is he worrying about the rival cartels the most, or is it his relationship with his own government, or is it the fear of the United States?
That's actually a wonderful question. I think that Chapo had a very solid handle on the Mexican authorities, that the vast amounts of money that he spent on protection in Mexico covered him in that area. I mean, there was testimony at the trial, for example, that he had a couple of spies, or people who were tasked with spying for him on the government and managing government corruption. And one of them testified that he, the kind of government corrupt agent, routinely spent $1 million a month on paying off Mexican officials of every variety, from the military to the police to the customs service, to you name it, to the airport people. And that was just one of the guys. And that's an astonishing amount of money. In terms of the Americans, I think that was, Chapo realized that the American law enforcement threat was a real threat, but he also understood that American law enforcement is not able to operate in Mexico freely. American law enforcement has to act through Mexican counterparts. So while the American government could conduct surveillance, could conduct background investigations into him, his empire, and his whereabouts, if there was ever to be a ground operation, a boots on the ground attempt to capture Chapo Guzman, it had to be through a Mexican entity, the police, the military, you name it. And he had so thoroughly infiltrated those institutions that even though he recognized that American technology and the drive of American law enforcement to capture him was a very real threat, it had to work through a Mexican counterpart and he was able to pick up on the threat at that point. At one point I describe in the book that American law enforcement often felt as if they were surgeons performing a surgery through a proxy doctor who's was actually taking payments on the side to kill the patient secretly. And so it was a very challenging thing. And so finally, to wrap it up, the real enemy that Chapo faced was, as you suggested, his rivals in other cartels. But he was a master at detecting weakness in others and kind of seizing upon the weakness when he saw it and acting quite ruthlessly to either eliminate or neutralize his rivals. And he was also just, incredibly brutal, and was very willing to use the government entities that he had corrupted to fight proxy battles for him against the other cartels. So it's super complicated, but that's a great question.
Do you mind if I jump in just for a second?
Oh, sure.
When Nick was doing his program here a few weeks ago, I was asking him about, in the opening scene of the book, he describes this scene of just brazen violence that happens, off of a freeway. And then you've got, not very long after that, this whole era, which El Chapo kind of represents, of just this almost Baroque violence, and assassinations and public displays. And do you see, am I on the right track as far as him being kind of on the ground floor, as it were, on that whole trend in violence and assassinations?
So the short answer is yes and no. Guzman was certainly no shrinking violet when it came to performative violence, right? There's you eliminate your rivals in whatever way, that's one thing. But you stage public spectacles of gore and bloodshed, he was not afraid of that. That said, he was not the worst of the worst. In fact, there was a whole school of thought that the Mexican government, when confronted with a kind of fourth generation narco trafficking set, who were just nihilistic in their violence, doing things like lopping off the heads of their victims and rolling them like bowling balls onto the floors of discos, or removing the face of someone and stitching the skin onto soccer balls, like almost incomprehensible gothic kind of acts of violence.
Are these the Zetas?
The Zetas were at the forefront of that. There's another group called Familia Michoacan, which also engaged in stuff like that. So there's a school of thought that, I hear the argument. I'm not 100% convinced by the argument that the government of Mexico essentially struck a deal with Chapo Guzman and his partner Mayo Zambada, where they would permit the Sinaloa cartel, their group, to traffic freely in Mexico, and Sinaloa would be the government's dirty hand to take care of these much more violent groups. The idea being that Chapo Guzman was at least a businessman who could be reasoned with, whereas these other groups were sort of, psychopaths. I hear that kind of argument, and I think that what it suggests is it gives an ennobling sense of rationality to government officials who may simply have been on the payroll of the Sinaloa drug cartel. Oh, no, we're not doing this for the money. We're just doing this because these are the most reasonable criminals in Mexico. And to fight criminals, you have to be a criminal. And so we have to resort to a partnership with these dirty people in order to, keep law and order in our country, right? So it's one of these things that it's virtually unknowable. But it's a fascinating argument that I don't think Chapo Guzman was the most violent.
Well, it's funny when you were both reporters, and when you read about the heroism of these Mexican journalists, did you ever get kind of maybe cold feet about covering this in such depth? I mean, you're protected, you're above the border, obviously, but there are a lot of journalists who have been killed.
I mean, look, personally speaking, no, I didn't. But again, I have the privilege of being north of the border and knowing that, there's not, I mean, look, the cartel has a very far reach. They can do what they want to do, but, they can act with utter impunity in Mexico. And, there was testimony at the trial that Guzman and his minions were involved in the murder, the assassination of one of the kind of most respected senior journalists in Sinaloa. And so that is an absolute reality. And the bravery of these people is just it's almost inconceivable. But it's not something that I personally worried about. So yeah.
Alan, if I were you, I'd be much more worried about El Chapo optioning your book for TV
Right.
and film.
Well, look, I'll tell you this.
That's when the trouble's going to begin.
I'll tell you this. So I had a friend who recently asked me, is it inappropriate to send, Chapo Guzman an autographed copy of the book to his, federal prison cell in the Supermax in Florence, Colorado? And I said, no, it's not inappropriate. But one, it'll probably never get to him because he's under such lock and key that, you can't send him mail as an outsider. And two, there's just no reason to poke the bear, There's just no reason. Because I love Mexico. I've been to Mexico many, many, many times. But I'll probably take a breather from going to Mexico for a couple of years.
Does he have a good agent?
What's that?
Does he have a good agent?
Yeah. Well, he is still actively trying to sell this movie.
Wow.
I recently met with someone. I can't really talk about it too much specifically, but I met with someone in the movie business recently on a totally separate thing. Went out, as pre-COVID, right? Went out, had a drink, blah blah blah, talking about stuff, and this person asked me what else I was working on. I said, oh, I'm working on this book about Chapo Guzman, and the person just blanched, went white, and I was like, what? And they told me that they had recently been approached to make Chapo's movie. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And this was like in March, So he is still out there trying to get this thing made from prison. He's got emissaries out there like spreading the word. It's crazy.
Now I read, and then I'll let it back to Nick. I read that originally you weren't going to go to the trial. You said, it's all been told. And is that true?
I mean, it's true to a point. So when Guzman was brought to extradited to the United States, I covered his initial appearance. I covered all the pretrial stuff. But when it came time to actually buckling down to cover the trial, absolutely. I didn't want to do it because I thought, what new stories could be told about this guy? He's like books, articles, documentaries, 2 Netflix series. Like, it's too much. Like, what conceivably could be said about him that would be interesting? And I even talked to my editors at the Times, and I was like, look, it's going to be a boring trial. I don't want to do it. And then in the end, I was like, look, it's Chapo Guzman. You can't not do it, right? And I went, and it just blew me away. From the first day, it like erupted like a geyser, and it didn't stop for 3.5 months. And as much new stuff was revealed at the trial, and there was like endlessly fascinating new stuff. You know, that was the starting point for the research into the book, which it's just, there, like every time I thought there was a bottom, the bottom dropped out. And even now, there are things that I, frankly, I was under a pretty tight deadline to write the book. And so there's stuff that I just wasn't able to get to the bottom of. And I would encourage other writers and other investigators to like follow up on the stuff that I couldn't figure out, that I'm still obsessed with and like fascinated by. So yeah,
there's always the trade paperback release, right?
Sure. Yeah, we'll put it in the next edition. But yeah,
right,
no, there's a wealth of stuff out there that still hasn't been told.
So let's jump back in then to sort of this, to really what forms the first part of your book, even the opening page. And so, we've just been talking about all the big picture within Mexico. And now suddenly you've got American agents who are beginning to have a really close look at El Chapo and try to find a way in. So what was that process like for you start off with FBI agents? You're looking, where you want to go, but you don't know who to trust or how to get there. So how did they get into it?
Well, remarkably, the FBI investigation that you're describing, that kind of occupies the first third of this book, begins with a random tipster walking in to the FBI's New York office in Lower Manhattan and telling the desk police officer in the lobby, hey, Chapo Guzman, you may know him. He's like the world's biggest drug lord. He hired this 20-something Colombian IT guy, and that kid built Chapo this super sophisticated secret cell phone system that I just thought you guys should know about. and like the cop doing protective duty in the lobby of the FBI's, office at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan was like, what? And kind of interviewed him and vetted him out a little bit. Called up, and he seemed sane enough that, the guy calls upstairs, gets the, Latin American drug squad on the line, and thus begins this really sophisticated surveillance operation where it turns out, hey, as crazy as that rumor was, that tip that came in over the transom, it was true. And the FBI was able to identify, locate, and turn that young Colombian IT guy to be a confidential informant and who spied on Chapo Guzman on the FBI's behalf, and essentially created the architecture of his communication system and then turned that architecture against Guzman. And it was a remarkable feat of both kind of investigative legwork and high-tech communication spying that had a lot of very, very challenging technological, logistical aspects. And it led to an attempt to capture Guzman in February of 2012 in the resort town of Cabo San Lucas. And that's the kind of first, the book is kind of structured in 3 parts, each one describing a surveillance operation that leads to an attempt to capture Guzman. And that's the first third of the book, more or less.
So, which begs the question, talking about this 20-year-old Colombian IT guy, how does a 20-year-old Colombian IT guy gain the trust of the world's greatest drug lord? And
Well,
why would yeah.
Well, you know, it's like you know, it's like Yelp, right? He had worked for Chapo's buddies, and Chapo's buddies vetted him. So the Colombian guy, his name is Christian Rodriguez, or that is the name that the FBI has given him. His Christian is his real first name. Rodriguez is not his real last name. But he had worked for Chapo Guzman's Colombian allies, a family named the Cifuentes family, which, you know, this was a, you know, kind of storied narco trafficking family in Colombia. And through kind of twists and turns of business and personal relationships, the Cifuentes family and Guzman became enmeshed. And after the young Colombian Christian Rodriguez created a very similar encrypted cell phone system for the Cifuentes family, the Cifuentes family recommended him to Chapo Guzman. Lo and behold, he shows up with a positive Yelp review, and then he's, you know, welcomed into the fold, and he does a virtually an identical system for Guzman.
And so as American law enforcement agencies get interested in Guzman, is there coordination between them from the get-go, or are people working in sort of siloed, you know, tents all across America, each pursuing their own investigation?
Sure. So the FBI's investigation involving this young Colombian guy begins in 2009. It's really the first big American push to go after Guzman in more or less a decade. The backstory on that is that Guzman had been arrested in 1993. He had served 8 years in a high security Mexican prison. He then escaped very famously from that prison in the bottom of a laundry cart in 2001, and had essentially spent from 2001 to 2009 reconstituting and growing his business. It was his second act. Guzman, you know, had always been on the radar of American law enforcement throughout all of this, but he was a difficult target, and there had been attempts over the years to help the Mexicans find him, track him, and there had been a bunch of kind of, I mean, I'll say half-hearted, but I guarantee you that the agents who worked on those cases didn't feel them to be half-hearted. They were ultimately unsuccessful efforts. But beginning in 2009, with this FBI operation, which was codenamed Operation Server Jack, things really take off. To get to your question, the FBI carried the ball on this surveillance operation for 3 years, and it was a remarkable feat. Never before had American law enforcement gotten real-time communications intercepts of the world's biggest drug lord, Chapo Guzman. You know, where drugs were coming in, who was doing it, what he was saying about his mistresses, his lawyers, you name it, like incredibly detailed information. That said, the DEA, which technically has jurisdiction from an American point of view over drug operations in Mexico, was never really brought into the fold in terms of how detailed the information that the FBI was getting on Guzman. They weren't just getting intercepts, recordings, text messages. They were getting GPS locations at certain points. And the DEA, once that became known to them, was livid. They were astonished that a branch of the American government essentially had real-time locational data on the most powerful drug lord on the planet and hadn't acted, hadn't gone after the guy. The FBI's argument was, let's sit back, learn as much as we can, and then we'll go in and get everybody at the same time. The DEA, by institutional culture, is more activist, let's say, than the FBI. And they sort of, working on parallel information, set up their own attempt to go after Chapo, kind of leveraging the information that the FBI had. There was a distinct lack of cooperation between the agencies. The intelligence services were involved and picked sides. The CIA picked the side of the FBI. The DEA was extraordinarily frustrated that the DEA felt that the FBI was hoarding information, that they were not willing to make it operational and go after this guy, that they were sitting back, they were acting more like spies than police officers. Ultimately, the DEA put together a raid, as I said, in February of 2012, and it failed. Chapo made it out the back door. But that failure pushed the DEA into action. And they then kind of picked up the ball and spent the next, late 2012, most of 2013, into 2014, creating a much more collaborative effort to go after Chapo Guzman. So they brought in not only another agency, a kind of a little known agency in the Department of Homeland Security called Homeland Security Investigations, but they worked very, very, very closely with U.S. attorneys' offices across the country, 4 of which had gone up on wiretaps of Guzman and his organization. And so the DEA kind of coordinated this interagency collaborative effort to go after Guzman after the FBI had kind of taken a go-it-alone strategy. And the collaborative strategy ultimately proved more successful.
You see, I found that all absolutely shocking to read, simply because, when I'd been writing about similar episodes in 1980 where some of these targets weren't reached because of the failure to cooperate between American law enforcement agencies. And the idea that these issues were still happily alive in exactly the same dysfunctional manner 35 years later blew my mind and was rather depressing. Was that do you think that was of great comfort to El Chapo? Would he have known of such dysfunction?
Well, that's a fascinating question, whether he would have known. I'm not sure he would have known. But to your point, the dysfunctional relationship between agencies was absolutely central in allowing him to escape the first time, in a sense, in permitting him to evade capture yet again, even once the DEA picked up the ball. I mean, that motif is kind of a sub-motif in the book, but you could spend an entire book just describing the dysfunction between the agencies, because it was bitter, it was nasty. I was kind of getting it on both sides. I heard the FBI version, I would hear the DEA version, I would hear the Homeland Security version, the U.S. Marshals Service version, and everybody had a slightly different version, but everyone was in agreement that it was kind of a mess. And it only worked once the agencies really started to work together. The FBI kept their distance after the Colombian IT guy Cabo San Lucas operation ended. Once that ended, the FBI continued with that down in that vein. They kind of switched horses. The IT guy was compromised. They had to pull him out and bring him to the United States to safety. But they had managed to recruit the personal assistant who was in charge of Chapo's movie project, to get back to that. And she then became their spy inside Chapo's organization. But the FBI politely declined to take part in the DEA's much more collaborative effort that involved federal prosecutors in Chicago, in San Diego, in New York, and Washington D.C., and agents in the border town of Nogales, Arizona. So the FBI opted out of that. But it's a great question of whether Chapo kind of consciously was able to leverage that, or whether he was just the accidental beneficiary of this kind of recurrent inability to play nice.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the book feels like a sort of technology versus terrain in these sort of close calls of when you get these extraordinary amounts of effort to get to the point where you're going to decide to make the move to grab El Chapo, and then terrain does play a part of it. Will you talk a little bit about that? Because this isn't, for people who don't know Mexico, this isn't Mexico City, right? This is
right. So Chapo had two defensive strongholds. His go-to defensive stronghold was the Sierra Madre Mountains in Sinaloa State in Mexico. And just to locate that, we're talking about the Pacific coast, more or less the central Pacific coast of Mexico. And you come off the Pacific Ocean, you go through an urban area, and very quickly you rise into an incredibly rugged mountainous area that is roughly the equivalent of the kind of rugged hills outside of Palermo in Sicily. And it's not, there's no coincidence that the Italian mafia was kind of born in the rugged hills of Sicily and Naples, in the same way that the mountains of Sinaloa were the cradle of the Mexican drug trade. They offer, both physical, like a physical barrier. You're talking about steep mountain peaks, deep valleys, dirt roads, switchbacks. You kind of can't move through the area without being seen. You are, as an invading force, highly subject to ambush. It's a terrain that favors the home team in the most profound way.
Copper Canyon.
I'm sorry?
Copper Canyon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's exactly like the American outlaws who would flee into the Badlands of the West. It's exactly that.
Geronimo and his band always used to sneak off to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Guzman was able to leverage the natural defenses that terrain provided. But at the same time, he always had a plan B. And he had an urban stronghold as well. And the urban stronghold was the city of Culiacan, which is the capital of Sinaloa State. And so you come down out of the mountains towards the water, and you hit Culiacan. And Culiacan is a fairly large city. It's 800,000 people or so. But Guzman owned it. And by which I mean he owned the police, he owned the politicians, he owned the kind of the wealthy elite. And what he would do in Culiacan is he would create these elaborate safe houses, and not just one safe house. He would create networks of safe houses. And most famously, he created at one point a network of at least 5 safe houses that were connected through subterraneanly through tunnels. And each of the tunnels had an entry point inside the safe house that was hidden in the bathroom underneath the bathtub. So the bathtub had a false lid, which would open. There would be a wooden ladder that would drop from it into the tunnel. The tunnel would lead into the sewer system, and he had created a network where all 5 of these safe houses with identical bathtub tunnels were connected. And the most incredible part to me is that the entryway to the tunnels, this bathtub setup, if you looked at it, it would look like a regular bathtub. And then the way that the tunnel was open is you would take some sort of like paper clip or metal, any piece of metal, and you would jam it into the electrical socket in the bathroom, in like where the tub was, and it would create a current that would snap the caulking around the lid of the bathtub and break the caulking. And then that's how you were able to pry open the false lid of the bathtub, exposing the ladder down to the tunnel. I mean, it's bonkers, you know?
Was the tub otherwise functional?
No, it wasn't. But so to your point, you know, he was able to leverage the defensive terrain of the mountains, but he also had these kind of sophisticated engineering projects in the city, and he toggled between them quite in a very shrewd way. Part of it had to do with his lifestyle. He lived in the mountains for, you know, almost a decade. By the time the FBI in 2009 went after him, he had been living up in the mountains. He had about 7 different hideaways, encampments, you know, and they were very, very rugged. They were like, this is not fancy stuff. Yeah, sure, he'd fly in a plasma screen TV every once in a while, but you're talking about like cinder block huts with wood siding, you know, powered by, recycled car batteries and pirated solar panels. Like, this is not fancy living. And this was a guy who loved fancy living. So he ultimately tired of living in the mountains, the constant movement, the constant fear of government raids, and so he needed that city living, whether it was going to a fancy restaurant, seeing his mistresses, of which there were many, and so he was kind of constantly toggling between these 2 locations.
So, well, you've mentioned a lot of engineering and tunneling, and maybe the most famous tunnel wasn't one of his between US and Mexico, but the one that releases him from prison the second time. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously that's a very controversial escape, and obviously it involved a piece of pretty extreme engineering directly into a prison, directly into a cell, directly into the shower stall within the cell. How was that possible, and are we really supposed to believe that was done without the cooperation of authorities?
And did it really have air conditioning?
Well,
and the motorcycle.
To answer the last question first, it absolutely had air conditioning. They rigged, they essentially had PVC that was rigged on the ceiling of the tunnel that blew air into the tunnel. And they had a kind of a sophisticated generator system, at the escape end of it. To answer the second to last question next, could this have been done without the help of government officials? Absolutely not. There's no question, but that the prison officials, the police officials, even the intelligence officials who were tasked with watching Chapo Guzman while he was in that prison were compromised. The Mexican police official who was in charge of the effort to watch him while he was incarcerated in, it's called Altiplano prison, was fired after the escape and was just, if my sense of timing is right, 1 month ago, charged by American prosecutors, U.S. federal prosecutors, the same ones who prosecuted Chapo Guzman, with corruption in this country. And he is at large in Mexico, but he has been indicted by federal prosecutors in New York City. To answer the first question last, they were able to, the digging crew was able to accomplish this remarkable feat of engineering, digging 37 odd feet down, digging 1 mile forward, and then digging another 30 feet up directly into the shower stall of Chapo Guzman's prison cell, the only place in the entire cell where the monitoring cameras weren't pointed for reasons of privacy, because the team, the escape team, was able to sneak Guzman a watch with a GPS application before the digging began. And so the crew was able to follow the GPS coordinates that the watch was emitting underground. And so they just tunneled toward the signal, which is kind of crazy. But this was an incredibly sophisticated operation that took 10 months, millions of dollars, dozens of people, and absolutely the cooperation of Mexican authorities.
Now, Patrick, I know we've hit our hour. Are we allowed a question or two, or?
Yeah, no. It's funny. We have a bunch of people watching. I think they're just no real questions. People are just fascinated by this, though. Yeah. Do you have?
I've got a couple of questions to finish up, if that's all right.
Absolutely. If Alan's up for it, I know it's getting late.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay. Last couple, Alan. There's a point in the book where you call the cartels more like a medieval aristocracy than a chartered corporation. Could you just expand on that a little bit? Because I love the medieval sense of it.
Sure. So, these were not necessarily always rational actors, right? The Sinaloa cartel, one of, let's call it 7 major cartels at that time. There are many more now because they fractured. But you're talking about a kind of loose, fractious coalition of allies, many of whom were essentially bonded together by marital bonds. So, I'm going to marry my daughter to your son, and therefore we'll have an alliance. In good times, problems were solved by the exchange of money, by negotiation, by alliance building through marriage, as I described. In bad times, disputes were essentially solved by bloodshed and violence. And so it resembles more the kind of like blood alliances and blood wars of medieval Europe than it does any kind of corporate agreement. There were feuds and vendettas and then like personal affronts that got in the way of kind of rational business. But sometimes business was more important, but sometimes people couldn't let the blood feuds go. And so that's kind of what I was getting at with that.
And then maybe as a final wrap-up question, has the arrest and conviction of El Chapo made any real difference in the war on drugs whatsoever?
No. Short answer, no. Look, I mean that's my glib short answer, but the more considered answer is Ray Donovan, who is the DEA agent who forms who plays a central role in a lot of this stuff, has always maintained that the ultimate effort to capture Chapo that led to his extradition and conviction at trial, he sees that effort as a model to kind of go after other narco traffickers in Mexico. And that simply what that means is the leveraging of communications systems, which are indispensable to an illegal organization that is spread across the globe, that needs to talk to, its members need to talk to one another in secret. If you can penetrate that communication system, that's exactly what happened, and create a map of the cartel, who is who does what, and who is in communication with whom. And on top of that, not only get a kind of global understanding of who the players are and what their roles are, but use the locational data that is embedded in modern day digital communications, right? Cell phones send off signals, et cetera, et cetera. I'm simplifying what's a complicated process, but if you can get both that holistic picture of the organization and get your head around the locational data that these digital devices provide, then you have a means to go after these high value cartel targets, because they always have to communicate. There's no way around that. They have to communicate. And if you can penetrate that, did Guzman's arrest affect the drug trade? Nil. Within weeks of his arrest, more fentanyl was moved across the Arizona border from Mexico than ever before, right?
And would a wall stop it, Alan?
Nil. None. Testimony from experts, meaning people who worked for Chapo Guzman, cartel operatives, described how there was virtually no drugs that went over, around a wall. They went through the legal borders, right? In the backs of trucks, secreted in cars. Like, there's so much traffic at legitimate border crossings that it's virtually impossible, if the effort is taken to hide the drugs well enough, you can't stop it. You can't stop all of it, right? So the idea that a wall would stop drug trafficking is, by the testimony of cartel operatives, ludicrous.
One of the things that Don Winslow writes about so beautifully, and is that a wall might have the effect of killing some of the nickel and dime players,
Sure.
And then forcing them to go through the cartel to get stuff across the border.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, I don't even know what effect a wall would have on illegal immigration, but my sense is that it might have more effect on immigration than it would on drug trafficking. Because the traffickers they're not going where the wall is. They're going where the wall isn't. So,
until there isn't this enormous appetite, American appetite for drugs,
Well, look, that is an entirely separate conversation that is wholly worth having. I think it was Patrick Radden Keefe in a article he wrote about Chapo many years ago, described the sucking force of the American nose bringing cocaine north. And unless you deal with that problem, then you're not really dealing with anything.
Guns going south, right?
What? Sorry?
And guns going south, right?
Well, that too. That's a huge problem. There was a lot of testimony at the trial that that guns from Texas and Arizona, border states, easily made their way south, and were unleashed on like gruesome violence in Mexico,
Right. Well, gentlemen, this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate both of you, talking to us this evening. Here are the two new books. El Jefe is Alan's new book. Absolutely fascinating. We haven't, it's funny, for all that you've spoken about, all the details, you've just the tip of the iceberg on what people can expect in the book. I mean, it's just a fascinating book. And here's Nick's brand new book, The Year of Dangerous Days, which I'm sorry, Nick, we didn't really go into.
Yeah, we didn't.
No, that wasn't the point of the evening. It was Alan's.
But we did. But as I say, we did talk about it at length a few weeks ago, and you can go back and check it out. Absolutely fascinating book. And there also, we could get into a whole other discussion about how, Miami 1980 leads seamlessly into, modern day times. We could get into that as kind of a final question to wrap this up. If people are still awake out there, there's that expression about, the banality of evil. And, as we read about El Chapo in the book, you get this sense of, on one side, he's a monster, with very, kind of emotionally stunted. Yet on the other side, he has these human qualities of, loving his children. And can you give some more just some final insights in what kind of a person emerged during your research?
I mean, fundamentally, I would describe him as a narcissist. So, there's no question that he was family oriented, loved his mother, loved his children, but ultimately he was a savage narcissist. And that narcissism kind of, you could say it accounts for almost everything. He was a workaholic. All he cared about was trafficking drugs, and at some point it wasn't about the money anymore. So it's just about the game. The movie was about the narcissism, the mistresses, the constant need for sexual affirmation. It all kind of funnels back to the same emotional soft spot. That's a reasoned speculation on my part, but it just seemed to make sense to me in the end.
Well, I think you just blew the film deal again with El Chapo, but
that's all right.
That's okay.
So
I don't want to go into business with a guy.
Who's number two in that organization?
Well, the guy so right now the organization is kind of, it's the leadership is in dispute. So Mayo Zambada, his erstwhile, and he's the partner who's still out there. His sons are definitely running part of the empire, and his brother is still out there too.
This is all Shakespeare, isn't it?
Oh, it's very Shakespearean.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just thought the whole story is operatic, frankly.
Right.
There's a kind of blood opera quality to this story.
Wow. What's your next project? Have you have anything in the back of your mind?
That's a good question.
Or just the daily onslaught? I've been following.
Well, the daily onslaught is pretty brutal these days.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah, the nexus between politics and crime is virtually synonymous at this point. So
all the pieces you've done on Bannon and all that stuff. You just can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on.
I should probably take this event in for a landing before I offend any readers.
Nope. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you both very much again. It was a really fascinating evening, and congrats on both your books, and have a great night.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Nick. Have a great night.
Bye all.
Bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.